Chapter 5. 4 days later, in the last hour of the fading afternoon, they were standing on the fourth-floor balcony of a substantial hostelry, looking across the green and intensively cultivated Gordo lowlands at the gleaming towers and massive battlements of the imperial city of Gordofane, strikingly backlit by the vivid hues of the setting sun. Even at a distance of almost 6 parsecs, the magnificent golden cupola of the royal palace glinted above the huge walled city around it. To their right they could just catch a glimpse in the far distance of the gleaming blue of the upper part of the beautiful and enormous meltwater mere, fed by the runoff from the 2 plateaus, amidst the extensive and verdant green marshes and wetlands that surrounded it. Leonard mentioned to Anmar and Dane that Meltwater Mere and its vast surrounding wetlands constituted a wonderful environment for wildlife, fish, and aquatic bird life. It was also the source of the much-prized culinary delicacy, the delicious so-called russet trout, one of the many things that the fertile region was justly famous for. The overriding emotion shared by all of them as they gazed across at the city was one of profound relief that the end of their hazardous and taxing journey was now literally in sight. The absence of the searing cold of the recent weeks contributed overwhelmingly to this feeling, as the lowlands blessedly surrounded them with the much more welcoming and gentler temperatures of pre-summer that arrived moons earlier in the Gordo lowlands than in the highlands around Rickle, and only made some impact on the 2 plateaus, in particular the upper plateau, much later in the year. They had considered continuing on to Gordofane that same evening, but after some mature reflection decided that it would be more sensible to have a night's rest and utilize the hostelry's excellent facilities to make themselves presentable before having audience with Queen Eruda the following day. They had accordingly availed themselves of the fast courier service the hostelry provided to send advance notice to the Queen of their imminent arrival and requesting an audience for the next day. Their more leisured progress to Gordofane the following morning could not have differed any more greatly from their grueling journey across the plateaus. They travelled in benign sunshine through parsec upon parsec of vine tomato fields, in which the vigorous young plants had already covered the rows of sturdy shoulder-high bamboo trellises that would support the delicious and plumply red fruit towards the end of summer. The bright yellow flowers that were already opening on a lot of the vines offered a lovely contrast to the green of the leaves. Close to the city, the tomato fields gave way to the citron groves that the area was even more famous for. It was a sensuous delight to travel through the groves, as the glossy dark green foliage of the trees was already heavily starred with the large creamy white flowers that permeated the air with their heady and delicious perfume. Pleasant homesteads, situated in generally well-kept farmyards, dotted the verdant Gordo landscape that spoke of orderly maintenance and good management. Once they had been admitted through the wide gates, massively set in the high, strong-looking walls of the city, Gordofane and its inhabitants reinforced this impression of prosperity. The bustling city was clean and meticulously maintained, and well laid out with generously wide streets. It abounded with thriving-looking places of business, eating houses, shopping emporiums both large and small, numerous hostelries with stabling attached, public buildings, healthcare establishments, reading rooms, and primary, secondary, and tertiary places of learning and instruction. They also passed several building sites, where impressive new buildings, covered with bamboo scaffolding swarming with workers, were in various stages of construction. Throughout the city, as the travellers made their way along the imposing main thoroughfare that spiraled its slowly rising way around the hill that the city was built on to the royal palace on its summit, they were impressed by the numerous public gardens, bright and fragrant with early flowering plants, fountains, and paved areas that abounded with shaded benches and seating areas, all well utilized by a generally contented-looking populace. When Dane commented on the fact that Zand, though properly muzzled and collared, and on his ornate Lound regiment lead, seemed to elicit less attention than he would have expected, Leonard explained that a division of the Imperial Lound regiment was stationed in Gordofane as protection for Queen Eruda and her household. So Lhounds and their handlers were a fairly common sight in the city, though the barracks for the Lhounds and their handlers formed part of the royal palace complex at the top of Gordofane, as they would see. So it was a better rested and indeed spruce and presentable company that arrived shortly before the noon hour that morning, in front of another pair of huge gates, this time set in the thick wall that surrounded the extensive palace complex. Though their faces still bore the aftermath of strain and fatigue, the neatness of their appearances left nothing to be desired. Anmar was dressed in a simple but well-cut dark green riding habit, the colour of which offered a striking foil to the rich red-brown of her hair that she had plaited and wound on top of her head in a gleaming coronet. Dane wore a dark blue tunic with grey trim and well-cut grey breeches. Lhounds looked particularly impressive in his tailored dark red Imperial Lhound Regiment uniform, glossy, intricately handcrafted regimental boots and regulation beret with full captain's insignia. The hostelry's proficient laundry service had removed every sign of creasing and dirt from their respective outfits, and Zand's sleekly burnished coat attested to both Lhounds and Anmar's efforts on his behalf. As they announced themselves and their appointment with Queen Eruda to the gatekeepers, Lhounds and Zand became subliminally yet strongly aware of the quietly energized mind space that existed in the largely telepathic community that they were now entering. It enfolded their minds with a familiar and indeed comforting warmth, as they were able to relax the habitual vigilance that all minds were trained to exercise around ordinary people in order to avoid agitating them. They were also conscious of what can only be described as the muted background mind hum of many Lhounds communicating amongst themselves in their own language, or Lhound speak as it was known. It was a more image-driven form of communication than the telepathic verbal one, or human speak as they called it, that they had learned to employ in their relationship with their humans. The staff at the gate consisted of 2 Lhound regiment corporals and a sergeant-at-arms, all 3 in company with their attendant Lhounds. Both Lhounds and Zand shared a cordial and welcoming mind-greeting with them all. After a brief and somewhat startled mental pause, Anmar followed suit, and her greeting was duly reciprocated. Lhounds smiled at her as he realized that this was almost certainly her first exposure to a predominantly telepathic environment. After a brief delay, during which their horses were led away to be attended to by grooms, they were greeted courteously by a royal aide who had been telepathically summoned by the sergeant, after which they were escorted to the palace. As they followed the royal aide across the wide paved space in front of the royal palace, with its eye-catching golden cupola gleaming in the sunshine, Lhounds told Anmar and Dane that the facade had originally been much more ornately decorated, in the more flamboyant style which had been fashionable when it had been built more than 2.5 centuries before, when the previous ruling house had still been in power. It had, however, been subtly and tastefully toned down by Queen Eruda, when she had the palace, which had been unoccupied for a very long time, except for a small caretaking complement of staff, restored and modernized for her own occupation. This was when her son, Prince Dinar, had ascended to the throne at her insistence about 10 years before, when she had voluntarily stepped down for him after a rule of nearly 20 years. On their arrival in front of the imposing edifice, they were met by a tall and very dignified man of indeterminate age, who introduced himself in a somewhat distant and aloof manner as Queen Eruda's senior scribe, before turning away briskly to escort them inside. As he led the way through a spacious hallway and then up a wide curving stairway with carved banisters, they were conscious that he was trying, rather contrary to telepath etiquette, to unobtrusively scan their minds. They all discreetly closed down. Then Lhounds had to suppress a mental smile as he felt Zand push the scribe out with deliberate and just slightly contemptuous ease. This elicited a sharp glance from the man at the Lhound, who managed to seem as serene as the unruffled surface of Meltwater Mere on a wind-still day. At the top of the stairway, the scribe led them into a large room that he identified as the royal antechamber, and instructed them to help themselves to a hot beverage from a table on one side of the room, and to take a seat and wait until they were called for your audience with the Queen. He informed them that communication in the palace was generally conducted verbally, as the levels of telepathic competency varied greatly amongst the inhabitants, and there were in fact quite a number of non-telepaths working in the palace. He asked them rather officiously to adhere to this practice as a matter of palace etiquette and courtesy, then took his leave of them. And it was only as they relaxed on the deeply upholstered couches that comprised the seating in the antechamber, and sipped the comforting hot malted brew provided, that they were at long last fully able to accept the fact that they had, against significant odds and hardship, successfully completed the missions entrusted to them. As Anmar put it succinctly, "Speaking for myself, I feel hugely relieved that I can now pass this burden of rumour and knowledge and speculation into hands much more qualified and better able to cope and deal with it than mine." Dane agreed heartily. "Too true. I can't wait to get back to the farm and give Dad a hand with harvesting the winter fine grain crop. It really is too much for him to cope with on his own." Then he clicked his tongue impatiently. "What am I thinking of? By the time I get back to the farm, the harvest will be long over, and it'll be time to start fattening the geese for the Yule Week festival celebrations." He added with a deep sigh and a rueful shake of his head, "We are a long way from home, sis." Anmar nodded in sober agreement. They were indeed a very long way from home.